Mesdames, Messieurs, bon, d'abord, vous n'échapperez pas à une manifestation de joie, parce que c'est le jour.
Ladies and gentlemen, you won't be able to escape a manifestation of joy because the Centre Pompidou is finally reopening, and we are really, really glad about it. I want to thank all the people at the Pompidou Center and elsewhere have prepared that reopening so that the reopening is as beautiful as it should be. The exhibitions reopen in 1 hour. So in 1 hour, you'll be able to see Women and Abstraction, an exhibition that has been curated by Christine Marcel, who is with us and who will be speaking shortly. 106 artists, I think, more than 500 works that start at the end of the 19th century. It's a vast and profound exhibition where there's a lot to discover, and it's very attractive and seducing at the same time. But it's Women and Abstraction is also a symposium that's been prepared by Jean-Marc Scolard, and I'm honored to be opening that symposium today. And the exhibition and the symposium form one whole. It's the policy of the Centre Pompidou to show and to discuss. And the exhibition has had great precedence. One remembers the L project in 2009 with a group of curators, including Camille Morino, who took a very radical stance by dedicated a huge surface to women artists in our collections. And we know that women artists have not been treated fairly. They have been able to train, they've been able to train less, they've been able to expose less and to create less. And we are starting to realize it concretely, more than abstractly, if I may say so. And the works that have been chosen in the exhibition show it in a very spectacular way. But the idea is not only to repair, the idea is also to experiment, to appreciate what art history is becoming, how one should read it once that body of works has been introduced and reevaluated. So we're not having just a few militant gestures. That activism can only be worthwhile if it can animate, if it can draw new lines into research. And the people who will be speaking at this symposium is extremely rich. I want to salute Brian Fair, Harmony Hammond, Griselda Pollock, and Adrian Edwards, a star guest, if you like. But I want to thank partners, the AWARE Association first, who have been crucial for this, the leg of Paris 8, and the Paris Lumière Commune, and one of the great friends of the Pompidou Center, Catherine Petiga. And I want not to forget Oriane Castel, who's been organizing the doctoral sessions. I want to thank also the moderators, Eric Dechassé, Valérie Costa, who will make this symposium into something amazing. And I also want to remind you that on the net, the MOOC has been able to bring together 40,000 people. So I'm really, really happy about all this. Thank you. Good morning to you all. I'm really happy to open that symposium, a symposium that's accompanying the Women in Abstraction exhibition that's opening today in Paris, and that will be at the Guggenheim in Bilbao late October. I want to salute the publication of a very thick catalogue, thanks to our friends of the Pompidou Center, with a lot of authors who are with us today, including Griselda Pollock. I want to thank the DCC and Jean-Marc Scolard for welcoming us, and of course AWARE, Camille Morino, who has joined that project, and her team that's been working with us. Catherine Petiga, who's a very faithful friend of the Museum of Modern Art, has also been very involved in that symposium, and I want to thank her. That it was very painful in a way to organize that symposium because we had to choose between 180 proposals, and I want to thank and salute all the people who've um, who, who've applied to speak at this symposium. And as the President Lasvine said, research is at the heart of our exhibitions. And in that research, hundreds of women linked to the history of abstraction and have contributed to the history of abstraction haven't been able to be presented adequately in their lifetime. So it's a way to open a field and to present them, to show them in an adequate way. And I hope that that field will continue to expand. The figure of the day is four guests of honors, 4 sessions, and these guests of honor are Griselda Pollock, who's an emerita professor at Leeds, and her immense work needs no introduction, including her last book, A Bad Memory. Bryony Fur, who's is a professor at University College, who's written so much on abstraction, that especially on abstract art, that underline the role of Goncharova. Harmony Hammond, the great artist who confounded the Adia Gallery, who confounded a number of reviews, and who's presenting 4 floor pieces in our exhibition. And she's also committed into political abstraction, and she'll be talking to Elvan Zabunian on Friday. And Adrienne Edwards, who's head of the curatorial affairs at the Whitney, and who created in 2016 Blackness at the Hayes Gallery, which was a great exhibition. The 4 sessions that will follow, I won't be getting into detail because they are very rich, but I'll just mention a few artists that we haven't been able to show in Women Instruction. Charmian von Wiegand, who was shown by Peggy Guggenheim in New York, who's a highly underrated artist. Anna Hirsch, and we know her photocollage more, and we'll see what she has done regarding abstraction. The Gruppo Como in Italy, Prina Cataneo and Badiali, Bettina Lotez, who's an artist from Africa who moved to London, and she deserved to be rediscovered, and Tomi Otake, who was a Chino-Brazilian and who invented a fascinating new abstraction, or Sonia Gitchoff in San Francisco in the 50s. So these 3 days, plus the doctoral day for PhD students that's being organized with the Commu UPL from Paris Lumière, will be fascinating. And I also want to thank the team of the museum, Laure Chauvelot in particular, all the team that's helped me organize that symposium. Thank you very much for joining us today and in the following days to discover these women who really deserve to be honored. So it's my turn to express my happiness, as Serge and Christine have. Happy to be here on that exceptional day of museums, of bars, and terraces reopening in Paris and in France. And it's great to be opening also that symposium. And it also brings back happy memories, because 10 years ago, Elle at the Centre Pompidou took place here. And it's great that in French, the French title of the exhibition uses Elle, they, these women. And it reminds us of that exhibition of 2009. And that exhibition, the new exhibition, will be complemented by this symposium. Research is at the heart of at the core of the AWARE Association. We want to research women artists, make them more visible We have more than 700 notes on artists in French and English on our website, and we'll have 32 more. Thanks to the exhibition, thanks to a partnership between Aware and the Center and the Pompidou Center. Pompidou Center and Aware have worked together before. We had another conference called FAIRA in 2019 on the education and training of women artists. So it's a great continuation to that partnership. I want to thank Serge Lasvigne, Christine Massel, of course, for organizing and for inviting us. Thank the scientific committee who had tough choices to make, and the scientific committee with yourself or Carolina from Pompidou Center, myself, people from Mer, and also Abigail Saint-Doudou, Éric de Chassé, and Charlotte Touché-Zarmagnan. That scientific committee has chosen remarkable presentations. And also want to thank my team who's here, that you can't see them, but have been working like crazy for days and days. Marie Chanel, who's head of the scientific program of Aware, and Elie Pandelaras, who was the great backup to that organization, Fanny Vernet. And finally, for the Pompidou Center, I want to thank Jean-Max Collard, who's here in the room, Christine Bolleron, and Laure Chauveau. And I want to thank Catherine Pediga, who has not only supported that symposium, she's also the president of the Friends of Aware. And I want to thank her for these two reasons. And want to mention the possible, or confirm that the acts of the symposium will be published, a third part of these organization. It will be published in the cahier of the CNAM, thanks to Jean-Pierre Criqui. And Christine, you've introduced Griselda, so I won't say more about Griselda. I'm having to add to a magnificent career, maybe a quote that I really like of Griselda's, which summarizes her commitment. I've been fighting for 50 years against the crime of art history in the 20th century, bid of specialists or curators. These art historians have not paid any attention to the most interesting characteristic of modern art, that it is the fruit of a co-creation between men and women of the world. Thank you, and I wish you a good symposium.
Bonjour, alors à toutes et toutes. Hello to everybody. I shall be speaking in English.
Bonjour.
I have to begin with enormous thanks for the honor that I have been given to open this colloquium. To speak at the beginning, I want to thank and express my huge admiration for Christine Massel and the entire team at the Pompidou for an exhibition I am longing one day to see. Also to Camille Morino and the inspiration she has given us with her Centre Pompidou many years ago, and also for the foundation of Aware, dedicated to ensuring the documentation and recognition of the thousands of women artists who have been left without the kind of support and visibility that we all need. So my lecture today, and I'm just going to share my screen. Could it be possible for my screen to be shared? I don't have the right to share it. I'm just wondering if those in charge could help me to share my screen so I can show my PowerPoint.
Should be possible now.
Okay, thank you so much. So my questions, the aesthetics of abstraction and the question of different entangled questions, for which I have borrowed the entanglement of the image you've used for the conference. I also want to dedicate this lecture to artists because I have learned from working with artists to see abstractly and to see art, even though the museums or the art world have not recognized this. So I want to dedicate this to Christine Taylor Patton, born 1943, an American artist with whom I discovered in the 1990s and whose work I showed at the 14th Istanbul Biennale in 2015. You see her here undoing a drawing which is, as you can see, 2 by 7 meters, made with a croquill pen and ink on paper, supreme example of drawing as abstraction and abstraction as a form of investigation and inquiry. It took her 12 years to produce a drawing of this scale.
Griselda, your screen is not currently shared.
Okay. You're seeing it, I'm seeing it. Okay, let's just go back to, I'm so sorry, I have to start again. Okay. There we are. Is that now shared? No.
If you could just click on presentation mode, but we can see your
Yes.
screen now.
There we are. Okay. Is that
Wonderful,
right now?
thank you.
Okay. Okay, dedicated to Christine Taylor Patton, whose work you can see here called Imagine to the Seventh Power, a 12-year drawing in the making, which she only saw the first time after the completion of it. And as you can see, it's 2 meters by 7 meters. Her work is an extraordinary variety of elements that are produced simply by what I call the mark. The mark of drawing is the mark of the hand with some kind of instrument on some kind of surface. And all of her work is produced by the single gesture of the movement of a wrist, creating the possibility in which the world of the kind of forces of energy and dynamics of different kinds, light, emerge in that simple correlation between darkness and light created by the mark. This seems to me one of the fundamental issues of the kind of a sense of abstraction, not abstraction from, but a constitutive abstraction produced by this engagement with particular materiality. The great project that we showed in Istanbul was a project for 2001 drawings, one drawing, that great big work, Imagine to the Seventh Power, a 7 meter wide drawing, combined with others that are 2.5 centimeters, each one starting from the single gesture of making a dot and watching what happens when the dot splits and following the logic from each of the drawings. And I'm just showing you a few of the sequences to see how many dimensions of drawing, whether it's the cosmic to the geographic, to the dynamic, to the organic, could emerge from that simple set of protocols. So this is one of the things that I've learned. But other modernists have not kind of engaged me in quite the same way. So I want to go back to Bridget Riley, who in 1971 announced, when interviewed by Linda Nochlin, that women artists and writers need feminism, this hysteria, like they need a hole in the head. And this appeared in the book Art and Sexual Politics in 1971, one of the first ones to dare to confront the terms art, sex, and politics, terms which were conceived by the modernist artists like Bridget Riley as both a transgression of the categories art should be not involved in things like politics, and an extreme danger to artist women, because in a sense they had imbibed the universalist mythology of modernism, that this was an art without any kind of entanglements, and therefore the raising of the question of feminism would be to compromise the escape that modern women artists had enjoyed from the over-feminization, the notion that there were women artists, which was characteristic of the 19th century. The moderns seemed to offer a liberation from the very identification as artist, and yet they became trapped in a condition in which to be an artist was not to be a woman and not allowed to speak of any question of difference. So in the 1990s, the question of difference became theoretically and critically perplexing and necessary. And do we think so now? Now, I offered an overly theoretical beginning, which was to point to the structural rather than art historical framework for confronting this articulation of art and something called sexual politics. And I focused on the socio-cultural condition of modernity to ask what it meant for the concept of woman, which was an inheritance from the Christian and Judaic and patriarchal conditions prior to the invention of modernity, but also for women who became in modernity not only the questioners of woman at all levels of intellectual investigation, from theology to sociology to art, but also as the political collectivity who would take on the challenge of patriarchy in their name, even as they contested the concept. I also asked, did abstraction emerge and diverge because of differences that were articulated not at the level of kind of gender in something socially given, but at the level of formal practices and hence transformation of the aesthetic? Should we understand abstraction itself as an inquiry into the nature of art on the one hand, but also into the nature of differenced being, which is obviously my kind of rather complicated Derridian formulation of the Husserlian question of being, the great question of the 20th century. And they go beyond figurative formulations of both art and being and become an event in arts history that has to be defined as co-created differently by women and men, and differently by women and men who do not conform to either of those appellations. So we're going to introduce complexity and entanglement into those very categories. And the question I'm asking is, what would they become, to invoke the Simone de Beauvoir notion that we become whatever we are, when they were creating as artists in a modern consciousness, i.e. a contestation of the existing symbolic order, through the generation of aesthetic formulations that it became possible. Now, could I find answers to that question if I appeal to the authorities? So I lined up some of the books I have accumulated to try and help me think through abstraction, but have slightly put aside because during the pandemic, I suffered from the pandemic blues, but also what I called the reds. So I went back to an essay I wrote in 1996 when I was trying to negotiate my relationship between feminist questioning and the social histories of art. I wrote a collection of essays with Fred Orton, but I wrote this independently called Killing Men and Dying Women, focusing on abstract painting in New York in the 1950s. And the question I posed myself was, what would Lee Krasner be as an artist who was a woman, if to be an artist was to be Jackson Pollock, and to be a woman was to be Marilyn Monroe? So not a binary, but a triangulation. And in this essay, I was trying to explore this complex field by making a very kind of Bryony Fur, and I acknowledge the brilliance of Bryony Fur because she taught me to ask this question: how does an artist get from one painting to another? And indeed, this was what I did in this work. So this took me back to thinking, how did I come to work on abstract artists? I'm not trained as an abstract art historian. I was trained as a 19th century. My doctorate is on Vincent van Gogh, and I remain rooted in some sense in 19th century things. But the issue is that feminism made me become a 20th century art historian and engaged with questions of abstraction. And it was, in fact, when I researched it, Cindy Nemza, the great American art critic, 1937 to 2021, we lost her this year. She trained me both as a rookie feminist and as a rookie art historian in Revolt. And it was, in fact, the Feminist Art Journal which set me off. Oh, and then her publication in 1975 of her collection of interviews with women artists. So this is a model of living artists who were there to be interviewed, were my contemporaries. Most of them were alive, even as I was never being taught any of them. So you can see the first one is Conversation with Barbara Hepworth. So the first things I had to learn how to find a way to write about were Barbara Hepworth. Since my PhD supervisor was Alan Bowness, her son-in-law, he could hardly deny that she existed and should probably be taken seriously. But it was from there that I began, and there was a pictorial autobiography in 1970 from which I could study. And I'm sorry, I'm going to minimize this. You can see she's even so famous that she got her own kind of Google place. The second was Louise Nevelson, the Russian Jewish American art sculptor, who could not be denied, since there in the Tate Gallery, acquired in 1962 and 1965, were two of her great monuments made by the collection of found woodwork, found furniture elements and destruction of the interiors of houses created into almost Aztec-like monuments. Again, she was interviewed in the Feminist Art Journal. And the third one was Eva Hesse, who of course had an exhibition in 1972 at the Guggenheim following her tragically early death. Already she had some visibility through the writings of Lucy Lippard, another of the critics who was enabling me to understand this complex moment of women in a modernism and abstraction, and women at the outside of it in the post-1970s conceptual turn. So we have that. She published the first biography. You can see memories of Eva Hesse already in my Feminist Art Journal. And then in London in '79, there was an exhibition at the Whitechapel. So these three were the substance of the lectures I gave to fine artists, to artists in art school, in studio training practice, completely separate from what my academic art history was training me to do, because as I looked across the rooms in all of these situations, what did I see? I saw 70, 80% of the students were artists being taught that there were no women artists. The fourth of this client was Helen Frankenthaler, who came to, who's everybody knows is unfortunately famous for this painting, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, and by her so-called invention of a new way of applying paint by staining and soaking rather than resting it on primed canvas. But the thing that precipitated it was an exhibition of New York painting and sculpture 1940 to 70, held at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, not at the Museum of Modern Art, but at the Metropolitan, which just had its first curator of modern and contemporary art, Henry Geltzaler. And this was, in a sense, the canonization of the New York school, accompanied by, in fact, the triumph of American painting by Irving Sandler in 1970, no women at all. His book, The New York School, in 1978, has 11% of its content refers to women. But of course, abstract expressionism was going to fulfill the logic of Alfred Barr's famous analysis of cubism leading to abstract art. So the destination of modern art was that, where he brought together, in a sense, expressionism and abstraction, such that the only sort of destiny this was abstract expressionism, and this exhibition was going to consolidate it at 400 works by 43 artists, 42 men, one woman. The one woman, of course, was Helen Frankenthaler. Helen Frankenthaler, this is the work called Other Generations that was in the exhibition. She was of interest to me because this question of photographs of artists like Jackson Pollock and Helen Frankenthaler, which I included in Old Mistresses, which of course is just emerging in French as we speak, will be launched in the course of this event, I hope, or in association with this event. But the question I was asking myself was, at the point at which painting, in a sense, becomes the action or the activities, the gestures of bodies at work with their materials, this will necessitate something other than a formalist analysis of the outcome. The question is there any significance of phenomenological embodiment and psychosexual imaginaries at work in this, in a sense, open post-surrealist space of, in a sense, automatism and engagement with a kind of process that allows for events to occur rather than, in a sense, having a project in the terms of painting. Of course, the kind of painting that photographs show, which were from 1969, is not anything to do with 1952, or indeed some of the great and most complex paintings she produced in the 1950s, let alone those of the 1960s. Here is the 1969 retrospective installed in Berlin with the two paintings, what called Nude and the Maud, which were the only two I dared to explore in that early kind of investigative and very tentative phases of writing about this kind of work. So the work she was doing in the 1960s was much more flood-like, very suitable for this theory of the stain as somehow associating fluidity with the female body, a question worth asking, not essentializing, but worth asking philosophically. But I'm not going into that, that's in the book. But here, obviously, in the exhibition, you see how many different ways in which staining, graphics, and in a sense, the permission for certain kinds of morphologies to emerge were possible, including one which suggests a female body, as well as some of these very abstract and minimalist works that she was doing, which are pure gesture. Now, this painting, Other Generations, is now in the National Gallery of Australia. And I want to quote to you the commentary by the curators. Other Generations is one of a series of paintings from the autumn of 1957 that can be distinguished from Frankenthaler's dense expressionist landscapes of 1955 and 56 by their larger scale, open composition, and gestural freedom. Vestigial images seem to surface in a number of these later paintings, for example, Nude, which you've just seen, Jacob's Ladder. In the National Gallery of Australia's painting, a female torso appears to materialize in the upper center of the painting. So here we have, in a sense, gestural abstraction, but always the risk of some kind of figuration emerging. And is it perceived, I ask myself, because the artist is a woman, as indeed in this. So this is Frankenthaler's answer to the curators. Titles are a problem. I often fear they're used too easily as a handle, leading to an emphasis on the literary or subjective interpretation in lieu of an aesthetic one. In the case of Other Generations, I myself would tend to minimize, yet recognize your association with a full female torso. One might project or decipher some kind of figure shapes. More important, different, carefully placed, various sized color shapes seem to spawn or regenerate each other on the canvas surface. Colored lines and forms working in a negative positive relationship that creates space. So what I'm asking myself is this deep tension that exists in this kind of work, this framework of very complex painting practices, is between the terms in which the artists think through what they are doing, which is to maintain a metonymy, some kind of correlation between the gesture and the material and the process, without risking falling into a metaphor, i.e. allowing the shapes to give rise to an association that will lead us to tie it to a meaning, a figuration. And this seems to me the central wager of this kind of painting, which holds us to the open possibilities of what I'm calling the metonymic, this correlation between body, gesture, and material process, which can be described in formal terms as the creation of space or the push-pull of negative positive relations, but not to get, in a sense, the dynamics of this. But the question I asked myself is about, was I completely wrong to make too easy a correlation between bodies and gestures, given the diversity of documented modes of painting? But the relationship of body to the scale of painting is precisely whether you're standing up or whether you're kneeling down and spreading work, will inscribe the imprints of the body, but the body is never a physical body, it's a psychosomatic body, a psychosexual body. But the question at the end of the day is the axis. Where do you sign the painting when you've worked all the way around it? Where do you make the choice about whether this is a landscape or a portrait, in some sense, evoking a figure and some kind of rectitude or isolation or self-presence, or where do you lose yourself in the spread of space? So why does a gallery curator also see breasts in the doubled form when you might actually not say, I'm seeing eyes? Where are the relations the artist is seeking to explore and control at the level of events that occur within the paintings. So when we see the space here, I've also done the exploration with the same thing about nude, which actually is given the title. But what I was interested in is imagining how and where that she actually painted it, where were the stains, what happened when she created, did she create the central void? Did she then populate the central void? If we look at it on these different axes, why did she make the decision, sorry about this, to put it on the vertical, to claim the figure, to allow the doublings to create eyes as well as breasts? And when did she suddenly realize that something had tipped into her mind and she was in conversation with the very foundations of this in the 16th, 17th century of this language, Western language of the female nude with Hélène Formant's Rubens? Where did that come? And is the title an evocation, not a description? So let me put this aside and give you a second case. I'm going to go to Brussels in 2000 to look at abstraction in textile, and also not in the art of the 1950s, the grand moment of abstract expressionism in New York, but in post-traumatic painting. Painting, in a sense, after the Eva Hesse turn, after the beginnings of conceptualism. Where is painting in that relationship to a different kind of modernity? So I go to Beaux-Arts, as it's now known, and I'm going to an exhibition created in 2000 by Paul van den Broek, who has studied the value systems and social norms in European art, syncretist traditions in the Canary Islands and Latin America, and indeed female religious communities in Western Europe, Le Jardin Clos de l'Âme, about the aesthetic practices of the enclosed convents of women's communities. And he also created the interesting dynamic of the history of colonialism with America, Bride of the Sun. But the exhibition featured l'art des femmes berbères, the art of women, of the Berber women, the great weavers of the North African, trans-North African communities. The Berbers are not Arab peoples, they are the indigenous peoples of this area and have a weaving tradition that goes back hundreds and thousands of years. And these are not patterned, they have sometimes do have events in them, but they're largely abstract and individual carpets created by women, as it were, one by one by women, but also carpet by carpet. So they're not a repetition, even though most of the photographs of the work of women weavers seems to suggest that is the case. But there is a language even to the patterns, which I will not explore now. Van den Broek asked Zaha Hadid design this exhibition in such a way as to break out of the models which would be textile based in order to understand this as an aesthetic practice. And she designed it in such a way that we walked through great sort of canyons of weavings. In the first part that you see on the lower left of the photograph, you were close up to them, you felt the weave, you could smell the wool, you looked at the patterns, you felt the energy of that. Then in the second room on the right hand side, you see they were placed in beds, as it were, on different levels. So your body inclined and you had to walk up steps to look into them so that they were not again flat. And then in the third section of the exhibition, they were hung in a kind of to convey the monumentality of each singular abstract weaving. Now, the third part of this exhibition that was lay between them, that you had to pass through between, to move between these three sites of the weavings, was an exhibition by the British and Israeli artist Bracha Lichtenberg-Ettinger, about whom I have also written and has taught me a great deal about this question. Now, her art emerges in the legacies of Claude Lanzmann's Shoah, a moment in the history of the engagement with the modernity of the Holocaust modernity. Zygmunt Bauman's great book would appear 5 years after Lanzmann's Shoah, 4 years, 3 years, 4 years in 1989. But Lanzmann, as it were, launched from on high, in a sense, a taboo on any attempt at representation of the atrocities of industrialized genocide against the Jewish and Romani Europeans in the mid-20th century. So the practice was of Bracha Ettinger involves an indexical image, an analog image, transformed into a dispersion of grains, electromagnetically dispensed in a photocopier's cylinder, which is then deposited as a material trace over which then an abstract gestural, not kind of gestural painting, but a scanning gesture painting creates veils of what we might say would be post-Reinhardt, post-Rothko understanding of the nature of color as generating a kind of field. And you see these works here. In the process of producing this work, Bracha Ettinger, who's also trained as the other language he has as psychoanalysis, constructed a series of categories for the notion of what it is that being a painting being with history is about, or painter being with history, creating the notion of compassionate hospitality, witnessing as opposed to witnessing, the notion of artworking in correlation to dream work, working through the work of mourning, and also the notion how art can become a momentary transport station of trauma. These are all major concepts which are explored in her collected writings, which I've just edited. But what I want to draw to your attention to is what Van den Broek had done by bringing these two moments of post-traumatic, post-catastrophic resumption of painting, as it were, after the conceptual turn and the turn to the sort of technological image, how he brought it together with a tradition that reaches back to the Neolithic period, where you've got the aesthetic monumental of the weavings and the political linear, in Julia Kristeva's terms, of Bracha Ettinger's work. He's challenging the structural divisions by which the West claims its progressive place in linear temporality, and challenged the colonial imaginary that divides the scenes of aesthetic practices according to Western phallocentric monumental time. And he allowed sexual difference to emerge as a resource for contesting dominant symbolic political systems by registering via Ettinger's work the impact of genocidal fascism in the 20th century as a decisive event for feminism, but also a decisive event for any history of women, since fascism was the force that destroyed the great feminist cultural revolutions of the early 20th century by a deeply anti-feminist political horror. But also that it is crucial for the history of art, because the history of art does not flow through the 20th century. It is ruptured by the migrations, the forced exiles, the mass murder, and in a sense, the arrival of totalitarianism, which of course took its root in Southern Africa, took its root in Latin America, and across the post-war Soviet world. So when we come to the Holocaust and modernity, we are now rethinking what modernity is. So I want to end quickly with some bringing back to my questions, and I'm realizing time is coming to my end. So what did the socio-cultural condition of modernity mean when we think of it not in terms of modern art, but in terms of this terrible rationality that will ultimately end in genocide and totalitarianism, as it is laid out by Zygmunt Bauman? And I want just to leave us with these questions. Why within the embrace of modernism, through the creation of museums and the management of what would be celebrated, honored, and presented as the art of the modern, has the exclusion of women artists been necessary? I think we continuously think they did it and we get cross about that, but why was it necessary? Why has it been sustained? Why was it so persistent and active, this absenting of the visibly present artist women? Why has this defined the modern museum and modern art history, even as the question of woman and the political presence of women as in the women's movements of the late 19th and later 20th century challenged that kind of modeling of the world in terms of the exclusion when women became new women? And why has this monogendered, racially exclusive, predominantly heterocratic canon been tolerated for so long, and that we have been challenging it, but unsuccessfully for over half a century, and even wait to the first decades of the 21st century to make even minor inroads in mainstream museum exhibitions. Right? Has any other museum other than the Pompidou even tried this? And they are still, if wonderful, exceptions, but they are exceptions. And then when we have these exhibitions of the L, the artist women or the women artists, we just find that despite our intention to honor them and make them visible, they are framed as latecomers. We are the new rediscoverers or discoverers of these hidden gems, and they are automatically othered and then collected under the category women, even as the intention is to make them known as what I termed in my essay, the historic and always present co-creators of diverse modalities of modern aesthetic practices. Now, the questions keep coming, including the fact that women or woman is probably the biggest problem for feminist theory. It has been worried over for the last 50 years. It is now positively disowned in some areas of feminist theory. And even those feminist theories who still attend to sexual difference are not in any way untroubled by the complexity and indeed our ignorance of what might mean. And we have failed to use, in a sense, our practices to tell us something about it. Now, I have created concepts for feminist thinking. We've mentioned some of them. I think that's the issue. And I've drawn on today, and which to acknowledge the concept of entanglement that comes from Edouard Glissant, The Poetics of Relation for Colonial Legacies, and for Sarah Nuttall and the notion of how we undo totalitarian racist legacies. So there's more that I could be telling you, which one of which is why is the museum and modernist and modern are a complete catachresis. But I am just wanting to end with you, which is that the radical contestation of modernity through avant-garde, through radical art practices of the patriarchal bourgeois social and symbolic order has in a way been betrayed by musealization, by its rationalization and the imposition of a structural effacement of the very artistic insights generated precisely by the co-creation of abstract art. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Eric de Chassé. Est-ce que vous nous entendez?
Eric de Chassé, can you hear us?
Vous me parlez à moi?
Oui, tout à fait.
Oui, tout va bien. Pardon, j'avais un problème de son.
Très bien.
J'ai réglé.
Merci beaucoup, Griselda.
Thank you very much, Griselda Pollock.
Est-ce que vous souhaitez débuter et introduire la session suivante?
Oui.
Monsieur de Chassé?
Oui, bien sûr.
Mr. de Chassé, do you want to introduce the next session? Of course. Good morning to you all.
À l'écran, c'est toujours un peu compliqué de le savoir dans ces présences en ligne. Je suis très heureux de.
I'm really happy to be able to speak after Griselda Pollock. Very happy, but also feeling very humble because her work is extremely important in art history. And she's one of these art historians that have deeply changed the gaze and the attitude of the generation of art historians I belong to, and the following generations, of course. And for me, there's a paradox to be speaking in that roundtable, because as Griselda has said at the end of her presentation, yes, there has been a great presence, a visible presence of women in exhibitions in our history, but an invisibilization. They remain invisible in terms of the evolution of art. But maybe the domain where their participation has been the most recognized or the most obvious is the history of abstraction, or and for a long time, since the 70s, the role of women artists has not been considered marginal. And regarding the post-war period, I think it was also visible, maybe more in France and Europe than in the States. But yes, that visibility was important, because I remember when I started, if you like, in the world of art as a student, and I was very interested in abstraction. In Paris, one of the great figures was Joan Mitchell in the early 80s, and it was impossible to write the history of abstraction of the second half of the 20th century without considering her work and considering her work as a major work. And at the time, she was considered within contemporary art, not considering whether she had a secondary role, or regarding male artists who had introduced abstract expressionism. She was obviously and clearly part of that history, just like if we go to geometric abstraction, Aurélie Nemours or Brigitte Riley were clearly part of that history, or Eva Hesse, same for Eva Hesse and others for other trends. And I'm underlining that paradox because it's important to bear that in mind. And I had a recent experience regarding Joan Mitchell that leads me to talk about this, the fact that for the catalogue of a solo exhibition of Joan Mitchell, I was asked to talk about the reception of Joan Mitchell in France, and I did not mention an anti-women bias. And my interlocutors, female interlocutors in the States, kept asking me whether I had not forgotten something, whether she had not been considered later in France, and I said no, that for my generation in the 80s, we hadn't really heard of other artists and of Jean-Paul Riopel. And Jean-Paul Riopel was maybe the husband of Joan Mitchell, but not, or the partner of Joan Mitchell, but not the other way around. So yes, I'll end with that little comment. And yes, it is however, it is very important to go back to the place of women in abstraction. I'm really impatient to discover Christine Marcel's exhibition, to hear the contributions to that day of symposium, and I'm really privileged to introduce two art historians who will be talking to us about post-war abstraction in the States and in Japan. First, we'll hear Izumi Nakajima, who's a specialist of feminism, art history, and contemporary art in Japan, who's a lecturer at the University of Osaka, and who has written several books, including a book published in 2019 that was very significant on Japanese women artists after the war, and that was published by Brücke in 2019. And then we'll hear Felix Vogel and Maja Wismer, but I will introduce them just before they speak. Izumi Nakajima, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Eric, for your wonderful introduction. I would like to thank the whole team of Centre Pompidou and Aware for having me such an important occasion. It's a great honor and even greater to talk after Professor Griselda Pollock, which is actually making me really nervous. So, but just let me begin. Let me begin by looking at two paintings. In this painting by Kazuo Shiraga from 1958, red paint spurts out like blood from the canvas, leaving clear traces of artist's body and inscribing his aggressive act of creation. In dialogue with informal painting, he believed that the action was the most important aspect of painting, and famously made these paintings directly on canvas with his feet. The second, by Atsuko Tanaka, is orderly yet dynamic, flat but oppressive, artificial yet vividly colored. There are no traces or little trace of the painter's physical movement as was the case in action painting, nor of the unstable materiality of art informel. As is well known, they both belong to the Japanese post-war avant-garde art group called Gutai Art Association, whose male artists, such as Shiraga, were known for their action painting. Made in relation to action painting such as Shiraga's, Tanaka's work has yet to be understood in comparison with it. In this short presentation, I will be reflecting on Tanaka's work in the context of other women's artists of the period, through the notion of anti-action, which I developed in my book, Anti-Action, Post-War Japanese Art and Women Artists, published in 2019. So after the Second World War, led by American occupation forces, gender equality was legislated, and women gathered attention as a symbol of the new post-war era in Japan. It was at this time that the art informel and abstract expressionism was introduced in Japan. Notably, this was a period in the history of art in Japan during which many women were active. Interestingly, the theorization of art informel suggesting that abstract art was universal facilitated the participation of women artists in art. As a result, in Japan, it was art informel that supported the advancement of women artists. In fact, when Michel Tapier, here's a Michel Tapier surrounded by women artists, the spokesman of art informel, came to Japan in 1957, he counted many Japanese women artists as art informel artists. Following Tapier's selection of women, these are the examples, the tendency of art criticism within Japan changed, and works by women artists began to be evaluated according to criteria other than femininity, which had traditionally been imposed on women. In fact, every woman. There were even some women artists who won recognition that exceeded that of men. Post-war abstract art in Japan was, at the beginning, an art movement which contributed to breaking down gender barriers. However, a turning point soon arrived, and abstract art ended up being heavily masculinized. Once the Allied occupation of Japan came to an end in the late 1950s, a tendency to identify more masculinity in Japanese art, which tended to be feminized in Europe and the US, increased. From around the 1960s onwards, action painting replaced art informel. Works by Jackson Pollock and other American action painters were received in Japan as masculine art from the very beginning. By introducing action, masculine style of heroic, violent gestures into abstract art by Japanese artists, Japanese art critics sought to assert the authority of Japanese art in the face of emasculation of Euro-American art criticisms. For example, in 1960, the critic Shinichi Segi described the paintings by Domoto Hisao, who was regarded as a key artist as art informel at that time, as follows. I will just read the part in highlight. Quote, Domoto's paintings have a somewhat bold and big-hearted character. They are manly and capable of redeeming the Japanese from servility. Segi's account seems to be implying the critic's desire to protect works by Domoto, an internationally recognized Japanese artist, from feminization and to emphasize their symbolism. Artists who were identified as art informel gradually came to be appreciated mainly for the action, that is to say, the act of painting, and the painting in general became a field in which the act of creation was coded as masculine. Thus, by the mid-1960s, action, that is to say, the masculinity of pictorial representation, began to be emphasized, and the recognition of women art abstract painters receded. Of course, that does not mean that the women stopped producing artworks. It is interesting that when action painting was in vogue, there were quite a few female artists who were pursuing non-action works. There were a number of prominent women abstract artists who shared, albeit not openly, a sense of discomfort or refusal against action. This triggered expression of resistance against action as a pictorial tendency, which had become masculinized in art critical discourse. These responses by female artists such as Kusama Yayoi, Fukushima Hideko, and Tanaka Atsuko and others are, I argue, a tendency that I call anti-action. Kusama wrote in 1961 that her method of expression was the exact opposite of emotional space created by action painting. Her famous net paintings were produced to counterattack the masculine implication of action painting. Kusama commented as follows in her novel, quote, hidebound art historians worship the pattern made by action painting, and in fact, Jackson Pollock's action of urinating on white snow or concrete, thus seriously upsetting the methodology of the penis. The sun shines brightly for the penis and the earth rotates around it. It doesn't really make sense, but end of quote. The nets that Yayoi Kusama produced with minimal movement of the hand were, in a sense, competing with the brutality of action. Alternatively, although she is not so well known at present, there were artists called Fukushima Hideko. Fukushima said she had doubts about the act of painting. In order to erase traces of herself while producing the painting, she devised a unique technique of stamping. She would create painting by putting sumi ink on a bottle cap, pressing it onto the image. As an expression, this meant no more than leaving marks in a passive manner and could be regarded as a method of painting opposite in character to the gushes of paint generated by aggressive action. There are quite a few artists who demonstrated such countervailing tendencies against action painting, but today I would like to focus on Gutai artist Tanaka Atsuko, who she said aimed at opposing action. Here I will demonstrate how Tanaka Atsuko's work resists the modernist idea of creation represented by action painting through a language of invention inspired by post-war consumer culture. Those of you familiar with Tanaka will no doubt know her painting employing drawing for her most famous work, Electric Dress. The way bright colors and reflective lights are depicted in the jumble is intense. Their impact is close match with that of so-called action painting. Yet, whereas other Gutai members such as Shiaga and Shimamoto Shuzo demonstrated the characteristic of action to the fullest, Tanaka said that she wanted to produce painting not with action, but composure. Indeed, her work were produced with neither extravagant gesture nor evident traces of the artist. Using shiny enamel paint applied in this layer that disguised the hand of the artist. Consequently, decisive interpretation to understand her painting did not emerge for a long time. In order to consider the significance of Tanaka's work in the history of abstract painting, here I shall focus on two characteristics. Firstly, let us look at the uniqueness of Tanaka's work from the point of view of their materiality. As Yoshihara Jiro, the leader of the Gutai group, mentioned in the Gutai Art Manifesto, matter was the important subject at the Gutai Art Association. Yoshihara states as follows, quote, Gutai art does not transform the matter. Gutai art gives the matter life. Gutai art does not falsify the matter. In Gutai art, human spirit and the matter shake hands, etc. End of quote. The subject discussed in the original Japanese manifesto was bushitsu, a word which covers broad range of meaning from substance to material or medium. The quotation I just read shows that the matter Gutai artists were referring to connotes a strong sense of materiality and symbolism characteristic of abstract art after the war. Viewed in the context of action painting, the Gutai Art Association's matter has been understood as the material that received the artist's physical action, such as the Crimson Lake paint and mud Shiraga used, or the paint explosion Shimamoto Shuzo employed. There, the materiality of painting was considered in connection with action painting like violence and aesthetic centered on the artist. On the other hand, Tanaka used paper, cloth, ready-made bells, light bulbs, industrial paint, etc. in her works. That is to say, she employed new post-war substances and materials which could not necessarily be described as artistic. Tanaka considered these the matter which composed her paintings. Indeed, the matter employed by Tanaka was the opposite of what matter was to action painting of her time, in the sense that her material were not expected to embody the subjectivity of the artist, but rather reflected her fascination with Japan's new emerging mass culture. There is no doubt that Tanaka Electric Dress was her greatest challenge regarding new matter. It is well known that Electric Dress was inspired by neon lights Tanaka saw from the train station in Osaka in the 1950s. She explained that her purpose was to eliminate all human emotions and produce the beauty of the matter itself. Thus, I argue that Tanaka's view of matter is not so much that of the creator of culture seeking self-expression in abstraction, but closer to that of a consumer, stimulated by a new culture of the post-war era. In other words, straightening herself against the principle of modern art, which privileged the act of creation, Tanaka produced her works based on the principles of reusing and remaking. Deborah Cherry and other feminist art historians have long pointed out that critical apparatus of post-war abstract painting had seriously misogynistic character, excluding women and popular culture as cultural impurities. Tanaka's interest seemed to have been actively engaging with this impurity of popular culture, which was not culturally part of high art. This also foreshadows the tendencies in the 1960s that engaged more explicitly with mass culture. The second characteristic of Tanaka Atsuko works I would like to discuss is that she hardly placed any emphasis on the act of painting in relation to her treatment of matter. From the very beginning, far from action, Tanaka's works aimed at not painting. For example, this is a calendar that she created at the initial stage of her career. Sheets of paper made from different new materials are stuck on in the form of a calendar. After this, she began making paintings employing cuts. She made the slightest cut to the edge of artificially dyed yellow or pink clothes. There was hardly anything painted, but they were still called paintings by her. Again, it is newly introduced post-war matter that carries the expression, not the hand of the artist. In these works, Tanaka appears to have been aiming at not painting. Bearing in mind that the trend of the time attached importance to the act of painting, this was a self-conscious act of refusal. At a time when action bore a strongly masculine trait, Tanaka's attitude could be regarded as an expression of anti-action that she proposed as another way of painting that reflects the material culture of the time rather than individual interiority. After this, Tanaka returned to painting, but her passivity towards the act of painting was manifested in the way she employed ready-made mechanical drawing in her paintings. This anti-action quality can be associated with the consumer quality that I described earlier on. The design drawings Tanaka based her paintings on reminds us of the post-war boom for science magazine and the Vogue for science kids in Japan. Amidst the remarkable progress in technology after the war, a physics boom occurred in Japan and many junior science magazines for children were launched. These magazines explained how to make appliances and toys involving simple electrical system, and the people came to across mechanical drawings while enjoying science as a pastime. I repeat, Tanaka's sensibility as an artist was, in the 1950s, close to the exhilaration brought about by the post-war material affluence and the impact of technology and electricity on the lives of urban dwellers and their interests in terms of artists reusing and remaking of popular culture, and not by the traditional sense of artists' individualistic creativity. We can understand Tanaka's pivot away from action towards anti-action strategies of embracing consumer culture and tactics of not painting in relation to Andreas Hyssen's argument, which, like that of Cherry, aligns modernism in pursuit of an authenticity of the self with masculinity and mass culture with femininity. As I have explained, most of those who were recognized as a creator of post-war abstract painting in the end were traditional creator of culture, that is to say, male artists. By taking into consideration that connection between Tanaka's works and industrial culture or mass culture, my analysis demonstrates how her works could be described as a resistance against the concentration on action-oriented art carried out mainly by men. Indeed, they were new attempts by a woman in search of a new relationship between industrialization, consumerism, and art. The lucid composition, flat surface, and shiny colors presented in this way would repelled the critical gaze of viewers seeking action painting, anticipating a picture in which they could imagine artist's action or identify symbols in the traces of artist's hand. There is no room for personal emotion to be projected onto Tanaka's work. These works of anti-action are to be compared with experience of commodity culture, such as industrial products and artificial colors. They are fit to be called representation of a new sensation the people of the time experienced. This principle of Tanaka's work demonstrates how, in denying action, women artists were finding alternative to the abstract painting of post-war art. It can be said, rather than the individualism of action painting, Atsuko Tanaka was bringing the experience of the masses, including women, to fruition in her art. Thank you very much for your attention.
Merci beaucoup pour cette présentation.
Thank you so much for this presentation. We are a bit ahead of time, which is rare, and that's great. And I propose that we move on to the next speakers, Maja Wismer and Felix Vogel. And before I introduce them, I just want to remind you that you can ask your questions now in the Q&A section. And I will collect and have a look at your questions and then ask them orally after the presentations, after the second presentation. And I propose that we listen to Maja Wismer and Felix Vogel and talking to us about Charmian van Wegen and abstract painting. Maja Wismer is the head of art after 1960 at the Kunstmuseum in Basel. And she was the editor of the monograph on Charmian van Wegen, and the exhibition has been postponed, if I understand well, and will open in March 2022, I think, and we're very impatient for that. But the catalog has been published. Maja Wismer is also working on the multiples of Joseph Beuys for her PhD thesis. And she will be speaking with Felix Vogel. And Felix Vogel is a professor in art science at the University of Kassel and at the Documentary Institute. He has a PhD in art history, of course. And he's a lecturer at the University of Basel. He's working on a research project that is called, which is called Art and Language Theory, Practice and Display. So a very intriguing title. And I mentioned her PhD, PhD thesis, but his PhD thesis was published in in German, by the DFK in Paris. And it's on the Hamlet of the Queen in Versailles. So a totally different period and a totally different type of object that they will be talking about today. That is to say, and today is the painting of Charmian van Wegen that most of us know as someone close to Mondrian, and we know that more than her painting somehow. So we have a lot to discover on this topic. So I'm giving you the floor.
So, can you see the screen now? Okay.
Yes, we can. Now it's better.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to start and then we'll switch and then I'll end. So thank you for the invitation to be speaking in this wonderful, challenging, and so necessary context. So Charmian von Wiegand and Abstract Painting, the Paradox of Transformation is the title of our paper. Whether as a painter, an art critic, a curator, or as president of the American Abstract Artists, Charmian von Wiegand, born in Chicago, Illinois in 1896, and who passed away in New York in 1983, repeatedly concerned herself with the history, meaning, and transformation of abstraction. While being represented in major collections of mostly US museums, her work is today virtually unknown. My first encounter with an artwork by von Wiegand took place in poorly lit conditions that would be considered anything but ideal. She was, at that point, an artist I had only just recently heard of. All the more surprising was the instantly engaging impact of that work, consisting of roughly 1 meter tall vertical canvases arranged to form a triptych and a full of brightly colored triangles, circles, and straight lines. In no way did these canvases conform to what my hasty search for the artist's name yielded by way of information, quote, painter whose work was inspired by Piet Mondrian's neoplasticist painting style, end of quote. The challenge of a visual language that, looking back at 20th century art, defies any obvious categorization was to be a constant companion in the engagement with von Wiegand and her artistic and intellectual legacy, as was the appendage Mondrian. Our research is based on the exhibition project Charmian von Wiegand Expanding Modernism, which was originally to be presented at Kunstmuseum Basel in fall of 2020 and is now actually scheduled for 23. Much of this paper's content was conceived and discussed with students of the Institute of Art History at the University of Basel, as well as in the framework of a study day with international colleagues that we were able to host in a pre-pandemic setting at the Kunstmuseum Basel in the fall of 2019. In this process, it became evident that, first, Charmian von Wiegand was an active agent in the establishing of abstract art in the US during the 1930s and 40s, and this deserves to be acknowledged as such. Second, Charmian von Wiegand's artistic explorations of abstraction are multifaceted and are spanning from neoplasticism to Buddhist mandalas, from automatic drawings to color field painting. Both her painterly oeuvre and her writing have to be understood as a constant negotiation of what abstraction actually is. And third, Charmian von Wiegand is largely absent from the canon of abstract art because of her multifaceted understanding of abstraction, and especially because she conceived her later work as representations of a specific religious dogma, thus entering a field that lies traditionally outside of Western art historiography. It also became evident that, from a contemporary perspective, this isn't actually to her disadvantage. Charmian von Wiegand's formation as agent in the history of abstract art in the US. Von Wiegand was initially active as a writer, and having arrived in Moscow in 1929, she became the only female correspondent in the Soviet capital to work for a US news agency. What interested von Wiegand about the USSR was not so much the progressive art by the likes of Alexander Rodchenko and Varvara Stepanova as the immediate impact of the revolution on the everyday lives of the people there, as well as the art of socialist propaganda. On returning to the US in 1930, she took part as a journalist in the debates about the social status of artists and the social relevance of art, all against the backdrop of the Great Depression, during which time periodicals such as Art Front and New Masses weighed the advantages of figurative art against those of abstract art. The artist and filmmaker Hans Richter and the scenographer Friedrich Kiesler became friends and discussion partners. Together with the artist Karl Holti, she worked on a manuscript of a history of abstract art. After reviewing the pamphlet 5 on Revolutionary Art, in which Herbert Reed hails Piet Mondrian as a, quote, true revolutionary artist, end of quote, she decided to meet the latter, who had just moved to New York from London. The relationship that developed between Van Wiegand and Mondrian in the 2.5 years that preceded his death in February 1944 was significant for both of them in various ways. She would henceforth edit and translate many of Mondrian's writings and become a member of the American Abstract Artists, which she would later preside. Van Wiegand wrote The Meaning of Mondrian, the first comprehensive article on the Dutch artist to be written from a US perspective, published in the Journal of Aesthetics and Art Criticism in 1943. Already in 1942, Van Wiegand had co-curated Masters of Abstract Art, a benefit show for the Red Cross held at Helena Rubinstein's New Art Center in New York, with works by Stuart Davis, Miro, Mondrian, Kandinsky, Richter, and others. After Mondrian's death, she organized several exhibitions for Rose Freed's Pinacoteca Gallery in New York, among them The White Plane, for which she also assembled works by Mondrian and Kandinsky, as well as together with Catherine Dreyer and Naum Gabo, an exhibition of works by Kurt Schwitters. While Van Wiegand is known to have engaged in dialogue with artists such as Joseph Stella as early as the 1920s, and she began drawing and painting around the same time, the first works that make up what is now considered her artistic oeuvre all date from the early 1940s. The graphic compositions of her works from the mid-40s, and even more so their titles, leave us in no doubt that, contrary to the oft-repeated assertion of her indebtedness to Mondrian, Van Wiegand developed her first body of work against the backdrop of biomorphism and its omnipresence in artistic and intellectual life of New York in the 1940s.
So I'll continue with Xavier van Wiegand's painterly exploration of abstraction. The question of what abstraction actually means in the oeuvre of Xavier van Wiegand is complicated inasmuch as her visual logic, aesthetic methods, and aims vary from work to work, and while they all bear in the epithet abstract, they are in essence all but congruent. The same can be said about her writing about abstract art that ranges from the rejection of non-objective painting as supposedly detached from all worldly points of reference in an early review in Art Front to an interest in Far Eastern painting later on, from a formalist analysis of Piet Mondrian's works to the idea of abstract art as the basis for a world concept of art. Let us first look at some of her paintings. An example of Van Wiegand's early painterly practice are automatic drawings, which she often used as a source material for paintings. One example is her notebook from around 1942 and a mixed media collage of around the same year. Another example would be the oil painting Forms number 6, Disparate Forms, as representation of Van Wiegand's biomorphic phase. Organic forms reminiscent of Jean Miro, originating from automatic drawings, are integrated in a grid that is not yet the Mondrian grid. In this body of work, abstraction is the product of Xavier van Wiegand's interest in psychoanalysis and surrealism, or an attempt to generate non-representational images from the unconscious. While paintings such as City Lights from 1947 can certainly be viewed as imitations of Piet Mondrian, they, like other works belonging to this phase, can also be understood as a literal refiguration of Mondrian's neoplasticism. After all, we read them not as geometric forms without external reference, but rather as the abstraction of an urban environment. What I mean by refiguration of neoplasticism becomes obvious in a direct confrontation. While in Mondrian, any external referent is eliminated, Xavier van Wiegand undogmatically uses Mondrian's grid structure, but introduces elements that have to be understood as representational. In that sense, Xavier van Wiegand stands out from Mondrian's neoplasticist circle of Fritz Klarner and the likes. Created just 2 years later, the work Radiating Plane, 1949, is yet very different and reminiscent of a contemporary fashion in color field painting. It must be regarded as part of a phase characterized by von Wiegand's adoption of non-representational idiom that managed entirely without any external points of reference at all. Other paintings, especially those belonging to her later period of works, further complicate the relationship between the abstract and the non-representational, as well as that between means and ends. One good example of this is Ascent to Mount Meru from 1962. A Western reading of this painting would interpret it as the geometric abstraction of a mountain depicted from different angles simultaneously, assuming there were any external points of reference at all. At the same time, the painting is bound to a traditional Tibetan style of representation in which showing an object at once from above and from the side is entirely normal. In this sense, Ascent to Mount Meru is a mandala, which inevitably raises the question of whether it perhaps functions more as an invitation to a meditation, the abstraction being a deliberate means to an end. Haima Sivanesan argues that this phase of Charmian von Wiegand's oeuvre represents the beginning of a work towards a visual language for a transcultural modern Buddhism. The argument that all those examples covering a period of roughly only 2 decades seem disparate and incongruent can only be supported if we apply the standard of the alleged necessity of a coherent oeuvre, or at least of an oeuvre that is explicable in art historical terms of a progressive and logical development. Von Wiegand herself was aware of this. In an interview from 1968, she went on record saying then that when she first began studying Buddhist art, she saw an, quote, aesthetic conflict with the ideals of neoplasticism, but that this problem soon lost all relevance for her. In order to give at least a brief glimpse on Charmian von Wiegand's writing on abstraction, I would like to single out only one text. Having seen how Charmian von Wiegand grappled with the abstract and the non-representational in her own artistic output, it comes as no surprise to discover that by the 1950s and 1960s, the fusion of different traditions of abstraction was informing not just her painting, but also her writing. Her essay, The Oriental Tradition in Abstract Art, published in 1957, was premised on the assumption that the establishment of abstract art in the West would bring it closer to the image-making traditions of the Far East. The consequences of this would be far-reaching. I quote, "During and after the First World War, the pioneers of abstract art formulated a new plastic language in which local, particular, and national differences were gradually absorbed into a universal expression. But today, everything vitally creative in art takes place, for the most part, in the abstract domain. All the aesthetic arguments are conducted on this level," end of quote. Ultimately, what von Wiegand was also concerned with the equivalence, even the equation, of completely different pictorial traditions. Here, the autonomy of modern art in Europe and North America, there the religious spiritual art of Asia. By implication, spirituality is thus upheld as a legitimate criterion for abstract art in the first place. Von Wiegand even saw the triumph of abstract expressionism as a process toward a putative leveling of local cultural traditions and peculiarities. I quote again, "Whatever beautiful works of art the abstract expressionists are creating, the movement as a whole has been one further step in the disintegration of the Western tradition. In this crisis, Western art can either move backwards into its own past, turn it on itself and mechanically repeat its formulas, or it can move forward and seek a new level on the basis of a world concept of art," end of quote. Here, her idea of a world concept of art was ultimately an attempt to describe nothing less than the consolidation of abstract art, which is historically and temporally broadened in order to lend it legitimacy on the grounds that it has always existed all over the globe. Such a notion rests on an understanding of art as autonomous and of its forms as detached from the local and historical contexts. Aesthetic methods, spiritual and religious ends, political demands, and local traditions are thus reduced to a single common denominator defined solely by a superficial similarity. This places von Wiegand in the company of contemporary authors like Werner Haftmann, who in his 1954 book, Painting in the 20th Century, developed the idea of abstraction as a world language, with which he sought to explain the worldwide dominance of abstract art after 1945 in an ahistorical, formalistic, and decontextualized fashion. Behind this, as with von Wiegand, lay the endeavor to establish an absolute equivalence for which cultural and historical differences were of negligible importance. Such a view is not unproblematic, since from today's perspective, certain tendencies would be understood as cultural appropriation. The argument becomes more understandable, though not necessarily less in need for further explanation, when the historical context is thrown into the equation and a specific understanding of the meaning of abstraction interpreted historically. Writing in the early 1950s, Haftmann's primary concern was the rehabilitation of so-called degenerate art and the aspiration that West Germany, firmly anchored within the bounds of Western liberalism, could reconnect with the internal art scene. Von Wiegand's art criticism and paintings from the 1950s onward, by contrast, must be understood within the cultural political context of McCarthyism, that is to say, the persecution of those on the left, which certainly included the artist herself, who wrote articles for various left-wing publications, and others in her circle.
Reasons for Charmian von Wiegand's absence in the canon. Charmian von Wiegand's artistic position and work elude any easy categorization using the selection criteria common to the 20th century. Criteria such as identifiable style or artistic innovation. Lee Krasner suffered a similar fate. But the lack of an artistic signature style isn't the only reason for von Wiegand's absence in art history until now. As Nancy J. Troy points out in her forthcoming article on von Wiegand, that even as the story of her engagement with Mondrian today counts as a valuable art historical resource for those interested in Mondrian's work, aspects of von Wiegand's relationship to Mondrian went unacknowledged, while the stylistic depth was consistently reconfirmed by journalists and critics, thereby shaping von Wiegand's profile and locking her into a subordinate position in the art historical record. Troy lays out how von Wiegand remained an outsider to the predominantly male group of Mondrian-affiliated artists, and how she continuously received credit neither for the effort of having translated and or edited many of Mondrian's essays, nor for her article on Mondrian, which she published as early as 1943. In awareness of von Wiegand's paintings, which unarguably depict the city of New York, we wonder from a contemporary point of view why von Wiegand, for example, was not included in American Artists Paint the City, the 1956 group exhibit showcasing that very same tradition that Catherine Koo curated at the American Pavilion at the Venice Biennale. The answer probably has to do with Koo's agenda at the time, which was focused firmly on North America. Artists like von Wiegand, who had a socialist past and who were not only open to, but actively interested in Europe's artistic tradition must therefore have been seen as insufficiently representative. But von Wiegand herself had no interest in debates with nationalistic overtones. By the mid-1950s, she believed the future to lie in the influence of East Asian art. Quote, "Today it is the arts of the Far East that are pervading the artistic atmosphere and whose influence we may expect to see growing." As of the mid-1950s, von Wiegand comes close to breaking altogether with what since 1800 has been one of the paradigms of Western autonomous art, namely its detachment from a religious context. This is also the paradigm underlying those various traditions which the curator Maurice Tuchman brought together at the LA County Museum of Art in 1986 for the exhibition The Spiritual in Abstract Art. The catalog contains an essay by Donald Cuthbert that gives us an inkling of why Van Wiegen's work was not included in that exhibition. Spiritually powerful contemporary art, Cuthbert writes, quote, is not the vehicle of communication of religious dogma, but of a certain kind of irreducible, non-discursive experience, end of quote. According to the curator and scholar Haima Sivanizan, Van Wiegen's true contribution to the history of 20th century art, taking the classical modernist criterion of artistic innovation as a benchmark of quality, was her work, quote, to produce an image of modern Buddhism. Felix has already mentioned it, that is an image of Buddhism as a transcultural phenomena, end of quote. A reviewer writing about an exhibition of Van Wiegen's works in Hartford, Connecticut in the early 1990s asked the following question, quote, so why, just 10 years after her death, isn't she a better known figure, end of quote. Any answer to that question would almost certainly mention her work's position both within the Western tradition of autonomous abstract art and in relation to a field that lies outside the purview of Western art historiography. Future projects regarding Van Wiegen should aim to connect her work not just to geometric abstract art, but also to artists such as George Brecht, Robert Fillou, or Ray Johnson, artists to whom Van Wiegen could well have had contact, given their shared interest in Buddhist practice. Then there is her work as a curator, journalist, and organizer, and her careful cultivation of her own biography and attempts to correlate it to her artistic output, all of which are factors that only now show off Van Wiegen's role within the American art scene from the 40s to the 70s. Comparisons with the contemporary artist Adrian Piper, who since the late 1960s has been producing art concerned with gender, xenophobia, and social activism in parallel to her work as a professor of analytical philosophy and her yoga practice, might also prove fruitful from this perspective. Asked, do you keep your different selves separate or do you integrate them? Piper answered, quote, there are no discrete selves to separate or integrate. My variety of professional activities are all different, equally essential expressions of oneself. When I am alone in the solitude of my study or my studio, I am completely out of the closet. I move back and forth easily among art, philosophy, and yoga, my third hat. It's the only time I feel completely free to be who I am. End of quote. Presumably, Charmian van Wiegen would have subscribed to that statement. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maja. Thank you, Felix. I don't know. I understand that, in fact, there was no Q&A session after Griselda Pollock's presentation. So I think it would be a good thing if people have questions for Griselda also. I don't know if you're okay with that, Griselda, but I suppose you are. And I'm very sorry because I missed your talk. I had some duties on the side, and so I won't comment on Griselda's presentation, which I will read a little bit later. I only heard the last bit, and I just know that she quoted Bridget Riley in a way which is very different from my perspective, and maybe from Bridget's perspective also, but that's also very interesting, and I'd be happy to discuss that later. I think we heard very interesting presentations of unknown or underknown artists. It's not that they are unknown, Both of them have been shown, although not in, I mean, I never saw full-scale retrospective of either artists in solo exhibitions. So thank you very much for your presentations of these two artists, to Izumi and Felix and Maja. I think they are also, you showed very clearly how they differed from their immediate context, and how important it is to reassess their work by looking at what their intentions were, and also how they evolved in time, sometimes, as we heard about Van Wiegen, with very different perspectives and ways. Maybe I would start by asking questions that have to do with this idea of false universalism that Griselda has written about so eloquently in the past, and I suppose reassessed today. How do you feel, and maybe my question would be first for Maja and Felix, because Nakajima, in a way, Izumi, in a way, spoke very clearly about this aspect, but I'd be happy if she would comment on that. How do you feel the artists you are focusing on manage this kind of contradiction between the universal, the personal, and the gendered? Is there any question of gender in the perception of the artist herself in her writings? I don't know about that. I don't remember her writing about this aspect. I mean, Van Wiegen. And maybe Izumi, you can comment on that aspect also, from the perspective of Tanaka's work and writings. And I don't know whether there are any writings. I remember only interviews, and you quoted interviews. So I don't know who wants to speak first. And of course, the question is also to Griselda in a way.
So, well, maybe if I just start, Felix, is that okay?
Makes sense.
Yeah. So thank you very much, and it's great to see you all. So when it comes to the question of universality, I mean, Felix spoke a bit about abstraction, of course, as the post-war solution to sort of find a way to continue. So for Charmian van Wiegen, who was on the left in the 30s and 40s, and who was married to a communist, openly communist editor, actually sort of had to withdraw. She wasn't given any more writing assignments because of the political situation in the US at the time. So I think abstraction and the idea that it was the feeling that it's sort of connected to other parts of the globe, sort of also channeled through her strong interest into East Asian art and approaches to the world, sort of was an inner solution, was a solution to withdraw from a daily life in a way, I think. So that was one thing. And I think that immediately connects to the personal component also. I think that then her deep and serious engagement with Buddhism, she was an active practicing Buddhist, makes that connection also. And the personal also combines with the gender, I think, because what I didn't mention, and deliberately didn't mention, because I sometimes get so annoyed by it, is the Mondrian story. So there are these letters and writings and diary components that are semi-public, that sort of give hints to a certain crush or a wish for a love story, if you will. But I wouldn't want to actually actively call it that way. But that sort of was a fate she had to deal with. She was sort of put down as sort of maybe a protective lover of Mondrian. And so that is one component where gender for her sort of becomes an obstacle, I guess. But then also I kind of want to reconnect with her personal story or her biography also, because she really cultivated her biography. She was never tired in repeating her meetings with Mondrian. When the Mondrian exhibition at the Guggenheim, I think in the early 60s or 65 became a part, she was interviewed and sort of really cultivated her biography. And I kind of like to quote Helen Molesworth in a conversation with Rebecca Quaitman, where they talk about the work of Hilma af Klint, and sort of Rebecca Quaitman is being annoyed that she always gets the biographical treatment. And Helen Molesworth's answer is, but why strip her of her biography instead of giving Pollock one? In a way, if that makes sense. Yeah, so that's maybe my blurry comment on the universal, personal, and gender.
Izumi, Griselda.
Well, Izumi, you go first. I'll...
Okay. False universalism is a concept that I learned from Griselda when I was in Leeds. And it was a term that appeared in the paper titled "Killing Men and a Dying Woman." Is that right? And when I was there studying about abstract expressionism and women artists in it, I wasn't really aware about them. When I came back to Japan, I realized that the false universalism actually worked in Japan, and that made a starting point. It just went halfway, but it made a starting point for women to be part of art world, which didn't last in the end. But and that is why. So it was 1950s. Of course, women didn't pronounce that they are aware of gender difference or they're feminist, but that whole situation makes it very late for scholars to understand women artists could be different without being feminist. So my study started to think their works in terms of feminism rather than just a stream of abstract expressionism. And that made the whole paintings by women look different from other male artists. So the concept is very useful and helpful to understand what women artists who are not considered feminist. That is my comment.
Griselda?
Thank you for the brilliant papers. It was a wonderful pleasure to listen to so beautifully researched and presented, and raising both the works of both these two, of the group of artists, Izumi, that you're presenting, and then Felix and Maja, the Shaman van Wiegand, who obviously belongs to this whole fascinating history of the founders like Elzefir Slobodkina, the very important figure, also founder of the American Abstract. I had so many choices in what I was going to talk. I was going to talk about Sonia Sekula, who is another of the artists in this interim space, who's part and parcel of the friendship network, lives, opposite John Cage and Merce Cunningham. She's friend of Frida Kahlo. She's there with Jackson Pollock. She's exhibited by Becky Guggenheim in the same exhibitions, and then also by Betty Parsons, but has to go to Switzerland because she can't afford healthcare in the States, suffering from a bipolar disorder. And then, you know, anguished letters we get from her writing to Betty Parsons saying, I'm desperate, I have no money, I can't be invisible. And then she hangs herself in 1963. So this is a real killing women actually exercise in terms of, but there are so many of them. And this is one of the questions. And again, you mentioned Catherine Dreyer, you know, there she is with Marcel Duchamp, and they have this sort of integrated project for the Museum of Modern Art. And then we get the bar modern. So I want to use that as a link to your saying about Buddhism. Why don't we talk about the Protestantism of Alfred H. Barr, right? Why don't we ever talk about the Christian imaginary? Why don't we recognize how much this has shaped this? This is the invisible sense, because there is an imaginary, not in a kind of, it's imaginative, but in the old, you know, the Lacanian sense, and also in the Frederick Jameson sense, that there is a culture, a political unconscious, a cultural imaginary. We talk about the colonial imaginary. We do not speak about this. Now, the Catholic imaginary, as Julia Kristeva has told us, shaped the whole project of the great moment of Western oil painting, of incarnation. Why is there figurative painting as the great art of the Christian era? It's because of incarnation as a theology. How do we get everyday life? Because we get Protestantism, which doesn't want incarnation, okay? So we get a whole shift with Rembrandt and Vermeer. We have to talk about these different aspects. And I think the biographer of Barr is very interesting about this deep anti-materialism. So his concept of abstraction was, we are going to transcend matter and achieve spiritual transcendence. That is a trajectory in the shape of that exhibition, as you know, of that museum, in which woman then becomes matter. And that's what I'm trying to get at. So this question of, what do women do? So if I can shift back to what you said about Bridget Riley, I'm totally sympathetic with all those women of the great modernist era who said, don't talk feminism to me. Don't talk about this. We don't want to be women. Because what they were embracing modernism as, which was not false universalism, but it seemed an escape from what I call the over-feminization, right? The 19th century, and the last bit of my talk, which I didn't give, which I'm going to slip in now, drawing on Julia Kristeva, which was that the 19th century pact between the church, the state, and the family produces a configuration in which gender saturates everything. This is the articulation of the bourgeois order. So the bourgeois imaginary is based on that, etc. So when modernism comes along, the women say, thank God, just let me be an artist. Let me go into the studio. I will think these, primary structures. I will think these great, spiritual thoughts, whether it's Buddhist or not Buddhist, etc. But what I keep getting at is what stopped that being the condition of their being recognized as the co-creators of this attempt to escape the bourgeois order. So Julia Kristeva articulates the avant-garde as precisely the something that is forced aesthetically and in terms of the imaginary and the symbolic to contest the bourgeois order of the church, state, and family, right? And all of this excavation of the Neolithic past, or whether it's the spiritual future or the theosophic cosmic, are ways of escaping that and giving some basis for this, not so much a false universalism, but an attempt at something of redefining being. And yet, all of you have said there's a really interesting artist here, but they constantly struggle with this sort of this sociocultural and imaginary order, which is about maintaining the gender binary. So difference is not the difference of men and women, it's the differencing of that very concept of making it much more complex. So I sympathize with Bridget Riley saying, let me just get on with, ask my question is what happens in light and color, right? These are really interesting questions. But at the same time, the price is nothing about, now go back to your biography, not biography, but subjectivity, right? I mean, we can tell the biography, I could do a different biography, one biography of the tragic hero of Jackson Pollock. Another one is a much more complex exploration of any kind of masculine, tortured or otherwise subjectivity, but equally, you know, Lee Krasner, you know, here she comes from a Jewish imaginary, just as the same as Eva Hesse does. It's a very different one. You know, it has different resources, it has different possibilities, it has different historical legacies. So it's not biography that explains art. That's what I call the biographical reduction. But these intersections of subjectivity, the socioeconomic, and then the models of the aesthetic practices which they give rise to. So my final point would be, there's a wonderful story with, obviously people know this, about Mondrian, who loved dancing. He discovered jazz when he got to the States as this poor lone Dutchman who has a curiously problematic Hitler moustache on some of his early photographs, always disturbs me, who apparently danced barefoot in his studio. So what happens if you imagine Mondrian's paintings being painted to music? You know, improvisation, jazz, different kinds of rhythms, da, 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 right? As opposed to the grid, right? You know, about this sort of deep structure. And what he said to Lee Krasner, he said, even when she was looking at her kind of coming out of Cubism, her early engagements with him, you know, like you know, all those artists were just kind of consuming all this stuff that suddenly appeared in the Cubism shows and in the, you know, the shows that modern MoMA put up, etc. He said, you've got rhythm, right? Keep your rhythm. Now, what I'm interested in, what happens when, that's what I was thinking with Frankenthal, what happens if you think this work, not through abstraction and order and grids and stuff, but a dynamic. I hear that, and that interesting sense of that. So, you know, Krasner's in a very deep conversation with Mondrian, but not because she fell in love with him or anything like that, etc., but because he saw something which then you can see how that takes a whole series of different forms across their work, because we're trying to understand what is the potential for modernist practices, including this most formal one, the most extreme one, abstraction, to change the ways in which these inherited structures of masculinity and femininity and class, you know, MoMA is the moneyed, you know, that this is the socio-economic order policing the cultural imaginary order, right? And that's partly what, you know, picking up on this, on socialism, yeah, we have to bring that in. This is a capitalist modernism. That is what art history has delivered, that, you know, silences the sort of utopianism of socialism and all of that kind of dream, which was also in a conversation with feminism. I mean, most of the great feminists of the early 20th century are liberals or socialists. So yes, I think it's this sort of entanglement. That's what I'm trying to say, these entanglements of these dimensions, which I think, Izumi, you picked up in a sense of how these things shift in really specific conditions, but that's this slightly more structural level. And it's not that they're feminists, it's that feminist theory offers us the means to pierce this, you know, surface of the music, surface of the things. And we need the concepts that feminist theory gives us around subjectivity, the deconstruct. It's not the gender of the artist. Gender is the most unstable thing. Woman is the most unstable term. That is what I wanted to sort of suggest. So I think there's a false use of universalism, but there was a reason why the modernist women embraced it. But then they ran up against the contradiction of a culture that was maintaining kind of hidden. They under-feminized, they did not allow any space for difference because you have to be universal. And then, in a sense, feminism is the repoliticization of that contradiction.
Thank you, Griselda. I'm just thinking, I mean, looking at the various papers and I mean, on your two papers and what Griselda just said, I think that we are living in a very interesting moment when we are getting further from the historical period we're talking about. There's been a clear break around the 1990s or something like that, and the way we look at these works. I'm saying that because I've always been struck by the fact that von Wegen's works to someone in the 1960s would have looked incredibly 1920s or something like that. And that was one of the reason, I think, why she was sort of overlooked. It's because her work is closer to what, I mean, I don't know, someone like Agnes Pelton was doing in the 1920s and 1930s, or closer to what Stuart Davis was doing starting in the 1930s. And you mentioned parallels with Mondrian when looking at her work, but it's clear that there are also parallels with these artists. And I was very struck by the fact that you mentioned in your paper that Maja, you showed an image of a 1977 exhibition where Vegan's work was shown with Johnson's work. So works from the 1930s that had been at one moment interesting to people, but in a way seemed belated, not belated, but seemed passé by the 1950s, 1960s. So it's interesting that the further we get from this time, the more we can look at these things anew in a way. One of the problem being, for me, the kind of mistakes that come with it. And I'm not speaking about your papers, but I'm just thinking there's a question about the late recognition of Jackson Pollock in France and Europe and Japan. And of course, if you just look at the market or at institutions, you would say it's a late recognition. But if you look at artists and what artists were looking at, it's not a late recognition. It's a very early recognition. And I think these kind of shifting perspectives are very important and very important in your papers. And the suggestion, for instance, that we look at von Wegen's work, not with its immediate context, but with something that was later or that was at the end of her life, what you said about Ray Johnson's or what you said, Griselda, about Sonia Sekula or these people is, I think, very interesting because it will bring new perspective. And I think that in Izumi's paper, I saw the same thing happening with Tanaka, which is like looking at her work with Kusama, for instance, and not only with the Gutai peers or something like that. And it's fascinating to see, Izumi, if I may say so, because I never realized that, how in the group photographs of Gutai, she's in the background, she's on the side, she's not at the center. It's clearly a male-dominated situation where she's just on the side or something like that, even though her work is so strong that I think that when starting in the 1990s, there were several Gutai exhibitions in France and in Germany and in the US. I mean, I'm thinking about the ones I saw. Her work was really striking, which is interesting. We have a few questions from the audience, and I don't know where to start exactly. So maybe I'll take them one by one. The first one is a very simple question to Izumi, which is your publication Anti-Action currently available in English or in Japanese only?
I'm working on translation, so it's in Japanese only. I'm sorry.
Okay. And a second question for Izumi, was there any difference in institutional support and recognition for women artists who lived in Japan, such as Tanaka, and those artists like Kusama who were based abroad for long periods of time?
Of course, in Japan, it's a country which is importing culture from Europe and America all the time. Those artists who had been in overseas, especially in Western countries, have bigger support and recognition from institutions and galleries. But In the case of women, I would say, like Yayoi Kusama, who they are considered to be more peculiar and strange person to be abroad for such a long time, rather than being seriously treated as an artist. So there is a gender gap between men and women in the treatment of in an institution.
Thank you. I'm thinking about Joan Mitchell in this respect, and I mean, when looking at her different receptions in the US and in France, I was struck by the way in France she is other in a way. I mean, she's a foreigner, an alien living in France. So she's considered this way, and there's no specific talk about her gender or about her female persona or anything biographical. Whereas in the US, she's considered first a woman and downplayed as a woman. So she's seen as someone who's softening abstract expressionism and all these kinds of things, which is not to say that she's not considered seriously. I mean, she's written about by people like Irving Sandler. So I think that what you're saying about the different reception between Tanaka and Kusama is somehow parallel to this thing, and that relates, of course, to the idea of how can you embrace. Behind the idea of universalism in abstraction, I think there's another idea which might be as important, and I don't know. I mean, maybe Griselda talked about that, but which is the idea of freedom, the idea that abstraction is something that frees yourself from history, from the context, from everything. So it's both universal and at the same time a kind of freedom fighting. And it's interesting that this, of course, goes hand in hand with capitalist talk about individual freedom and all that. But I think it was also quite important in this respect. So maybe I'll go to one next set of questions. So I mean, it's a strange question for me to relate. I won't try to I won't try to translate it. I leave it to professional translators. So, but it's a question to Griselda. I read it. Griselda Pollock, vous avez conclu votre...
Griselda Pollock, you have concluded your presentation by an assessment of failure in the past 50 years. Does that mean that doesn't that question the whole discipline of art history in itself? Can art history be reformed through its institutions? If yes, how? But as considering my institutional position, I would say that yes, I do believe that art history can be reformed by its institutions and within its institutions, but I'd be delighted to hear what Griselda might have to say about this, including it in another meaning that the one I see.
Infiniment pour la question. Thank you very much for this question. The question, I think, well, you're actually addressing somebody for whom, and why I presented the talk in the way I did was to say that I am undisciplined. I come to the study of the 20th century not having been taught the proper things. I attended beautiful lectures by John Golding because in the 1970s when I was studying, in a sense, you could do Picasso and Matisse just about because these people said Henri and Pablo, they went and visited them every summer, the people who were writing about them, but there wasn't a formalization of the history of modern art as such. So this is why I'm free. I'm undisciplined by that notion that this is what I should learn and stuff. And this gives me a certain freedom. But the question was when feminist questioning met what I had was what art history, it's not that I became a feminist art historian. I don't think that's possible. I'm a feminist who intervenes in and then pluralizes art's histories, because there are several narratives, there are different stories. I'm not creating a hierarchy, but there are important ways that people should be confronted with the fact that the institutionalization and I think it's the musealization. I think museums require logic, order, choreography, trajectory. They spatialize time, right? So there are certain structural things that came with this conflict between, as Gertrude Stein said, you can have the modern and you can have a museum. You cannot have a museum of modern art. And I think the Museum of Modern Art has damaged our understanding of the complexity of the art of the modern. So I think it's not reform, it is intervention, it's challenging, and it doesn't get rid of certain discipline trainings. But I've listened to you all, it's very nice, but it's the same thing. Who influenced him? Who influenced her? What did she do? What group they were in? It's gossip. A lot of art history is gossip, right? And then we write narratives, we create biographies, we put the work in some sequence, and even you, with great respect, Eric, I mean, you know, you're situating Charmin van Wiegand, whereas I would say, what's the event she introduces? Now, it may be not a big event in the sense of redirecting significantly the whole, you know, take of art, but it's a serious engagement with those questions delivered in a way that if we additively understood these different articulations of these aesthetic practices, and I can link this with another question I see about, can we redo the history of the modernism? What is modernism? I call it the art of the modern. I situated it in relation to modernity. 19th century modernity, the call for painters of modern life, led to the foundation of the first egalitarian art movement. The Impressionist circle was absolutely egalitarian from the beginning. You know, open 1874, Monet, Morisot, they are side by side on the page. This is a really important aspect of the modern. It's part of all the organizations. If you go anywhere, if you traveled anywhere in the early 20th century to as Barr did, to study modern, you would find, you know, the Stepanovas and the Rodchenkos, you would find all the men and women, they would sometimes be in bed together, they would sometimes be not. All the women would be in bed together, sometimes not, but they're all together living in these little, you know, bateau la, you know, whatever it is that, old memory lost, but I mean, Picasso, you know, the Bateau la Voix, or in, you know, Montparnasse, you could not see men and women, queer and straight, black and white, Latin American and Chinese, creating modernism side by side. But when they came to make the museum, that disappears. So I'm constantly telling us we need to understand what structures and disciplines our way of, and who is behind it, why, who does it serve? Now, to bring it round to the final end of that question, I have an article I just downloaded a couple of weeks ago, which said, great opportunities for investors. All these feminists pushing this new thing about women artists, low prices now, but they will write about them and you will make a killing in your investment. So the financialization of art will be ultimately the thing that is changing it. But on the art market, 2% of the current sales on auctions are of women artists. And of that 2%, 47% are just 5 women artists, one of which is Louise Bourgeois, Carrie Noland, Joan Mitchell, Yayoi Kusama, and for some reason, I always repress the knowledge of the 5th one, purely Freudian. I don't know who, I can't remember. But that's 5 women are the ones on the sales, and you've mentioned those. So that's going to be the new problem. How do we untangle how the financialization of the art market? Look at Kasmin has taken over Lee Krasmer. You know, I can hardly afford the quantity of books they're producing on every single quality. Frankenthaler is now with, it's just gone out of my head, not Gagosian. Right. This is what's happening. It's not the museums now, it's the art market. And talking of what you were saying, Eric, about how the abstract, you know, looking at the 50s or these earlier moments, investment will find a way to bring them in. And that's why I wrote my book this summer, which was, or last year during the pandemic, which was, look at all the big abstract expressionist exhibitions. You know, okay, David Anfam just about allowed Joan Mitchell into his big show. Whatever reasons, made Frankenthal and Lee Krasner followers along with Janet Sobel of Pollock, complete misrepresentation. A couple of weeks later, months later, I noticed he's been commissioned to write works by Kasmin for their big publication on Lee Krasner. So art history needs to understand its structural role in perpetuating our sexual hierarchy. At the same time, we're going to be very nervous now about the fact that money will change it, but without any level of our feminist understanding of what it is that happened or what it is to read these works, not for their place in this notion that what happened in the modern is invention of new styles or forms or ways of painting, but engagements with modernity, and that modernity is not stable. 19th century modernity, early 20th century, post-fascist, as you've suggested with Haftman. Haftman's book does put back art, but without any women. Okay, 1955, you know, that's where, you know, it's the legacy of that fascist revolt against the earlier feminist movement. And then in my generation, we arrived stranded without knowledge of what had happened before and had to sort of pick up bits and pieces, as I say, like the Feminist Art News. Those things were the only way we had into it, because these were, you know, invisibilized or sacralized, or, you know, one or two people were allowed to exist, like Barbara Hepworth. So yeah, can art history be reformed? I've spent 50 years saying, I think art history is a fantastic subject, but not if it persists in these foreclosures of social history, queer history, colonial history, and in question of this major question of sexual difference, as well as all the other complexities of difference in a post-colonial, queer, international, socially, and now contemporarily sort of uniformly capitalist world.
Thank you. I think, I mean, I would concur with you on most points, Griselda. I don't know. I mean, I think that's the way we try. I mean, a lot of us are trying to practice art history within art history, which is bringing in a lot of different questions and all that. And I think that it has changed a lot. I mean, my concern would be how the market is now more and more the dominant figure. And the market is trying all the way to stress full stories, as you just said. And that includes nowadays reinstating some artists for, I mean, not for wrong reasons. If people like them, it's fine. I have nothing against it, and want to understand why they like them. My idea of art history is that you try to understand how a work of art was created, in what context, and how it articulates different situations, to understand why it has an effect today. And of course, so the various issues, I mean, a lot of issues are bearing on that, on these different aspects. One of them being, and I'm sorry to go back for the last question because we have to close. One of them being the context of the creation and this precision in looking at times. And one of the question was asked to Izumi is, and it's the last one, and we'll close this session after that and resume at 2 p.m. I would want to know if the concept of anti-action is something that the Japanese artists have consciously considered or written about as an artistic strategy, or if it is a concept that you developed from your perception of their work.
Yes, to answer simply, this is the concept I developed, and people were not thinking about anti-action at that time. But as I said in the presentation, there are quite a few women who express refusal to action paintings, and it's not just a woman. There are other male artists who did not like action painting and tried to go against it. So I thought that that concept pluralize the story of abstract art that is always centered in action painting at that time.
Thank you. I think we can conclude with that, with the idea that there's a real need to pluralize the history of abstraction, that it's been underway for a long time. It's not completely successful yet. I think that what this exhibition project, that the general project of AWARE are making is trying to pluralize and introduce complexity in a narrative that has been too simple for a very long time. And in a way, and maybe to go back to what Griselda was saying, I think that we are, I mean, there's the moment in history where you concentrate on emergence and the kind of how things are emerging out there and how they break a narrative, then a moment when the narrative is basically laying on the floor to be picked up and reassembled. And I think that there's a real, I mean, we are actually at this moment and facing, and I'm coming back to the market and ending with that, this moment when, I mean, either we let the market seize these pieces and reassemble what it wants as a narrative, or we do it. And that's how I feel these various projects, including this colloque, are doing. So thanks to you all. Thanks Griselda Pollock, thanks Maja Wismer and Felix Vogel, and thanks to Izumi Nakajima for your wonderful papers, and I look forward to resuming these sessions at 2 p.m. on Zoom and seeing the exhibition for all of you who are in Paris or will come to Paris at one point. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you all. Thank you for your papers. Pleasure.
Merci à vous.
Thank you. Okay.
Merci beaucoup. Griselda, see you soon, I hope.
Well, yeah, I have to, well, the problem is there's no way to get to France safely except in a car. We're not, you know.
I know. I have to